I grew up in a town in Northern Ireland called Craigavon, and in Craigavon it's perfectly normal. Alcoholism is very common, and it is very, very normal to drink. Everybody drinks, even though most people are not alcoholic. There are a higher percentage of alcoholics there and a higher percentage of heavy drinkers. But most everybody drinks. It's very rare in that community to find somebody who doesn't drink. My mother and father weren't drinkers. I mean, my dad didn't drink at all. My mother drank occasionally, but didn't have a problem with it. Was not, and not even close to being an alcoholic. And yet, 4 out of 6 of the siblings ended up being full-blown. And my other 2 brothers, part of the only reason why they didn't succumb to it was because they both left. One went to Germany and one went to Canada. So, you know, it's not just about families, it's about community, because community is the extended family. I started drinking when I was 13 and it was normal. And that was almost a rite of passage in the estate where I grew up and in most of the places close by. And that's what you did. And not long after that, I started smoking cannabis. And that was another thing. The two went hand in hand. But it was normal. Nobody questioned it. That was what you did. And this is one of the things that it's very difficult for people who don't understand addiction to get their heads around. This is some people's normality. And knowing that it's wrong among the self-righteous does not stop the fact that some people's minds have actually come to accept that as being completely normal. When people used to tell me I had a problem with alcohol, I didn't know what they were talking about. I couldn't comprehend what they were talking about. The reality of it was that denial is the cornerstone of addiction. This is not a case of you can just snap your fingers and know something. Denial stops you from finding these things out about yourself. And the only way that you can come to terms with it and actually come to realize yourself is through a lot of hardship, which luckily I'm still alive after it all, but that's how I got the realization. My sister died in 2000, in the year 2000, on the 5th of November. And I didn't face that, didn't accept it, didn't accept her death, wasn't able to. I hadn't spoken to her for quite a few weeks before she died because I didn't understand alcoholism at that point. And I was just really angry with her that she was doing this to herself because she had been doing it for years. And it got to the point at the end, we were just waiting for her to die. And it happened, eventually it happened. So I not only didn't grieve properly, but I was left with a huge amount of guilt after Stephanie's death. My brother, and he had a massive brainstem stroke 4.5 years later, and he actually ended up in a wheelchair. Some people will say that wasn't to do with alcohol, but alcohol was a big factor in it, as well as smoking and drugs and, you know, diet and lifestyle generally. My other sister has a problem with it as well. And I became alcoholic. I was a heavy drinker for most of my life, and I became full-blown alcoholic after my brother had the stroke because I couldn't cope with anything at that point. I snapped, I just broke. And I started drinking every day at that point, and I carried on drinking every day for 5 years. Eventually, I was able to stop, but it took a lot for me to do that. I lost everything. I lost the love of my life. I lost jobs. I nearly lost my life. I was trying to kill myself. I was suicidal. I was locked in depression. I'm lucky to be alive. I'm really lucky to be alive. But the basis of it was, you know, it just went back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. One of the most difficult things about alcoholism and addiction is that people don't understand it, and people blame the addict. And while, yes, people should take responsibility for their actions, I didn't know what I was doing. And some people are going to see that as being an excuse. I don't really care about that anymore because I understand it. But it's not a choice. And this is something that most people will never be able to get their heads around because the majority of people don't understand it. I moved out of my hometown in order to get sober. I needed to get away from my hometown because my hometown, just everybody drinks and everything involved that, and it was too much of a reminder. But I had promised my mum that I was going to stay in Northern Ireland, and I did that. But then she died in 2015, and I had already decided that if mum dies, I'm going to leave Northern Ireland, and that's what I did. So towards the end of 2015, I came over here. I was in London. I had a job, but the rent in North London, I was staying in Enfield, and the rent is extortionate, and I couldn't cover it. I wasn't able to pay the rent. So I became homeless for purely financial reasons. For me, I had already been through, people can't even imagine what I'd been through in my head and with my emotions and with trying to commit suicide on a regular basis and having that darkness. So I had already been through a lot. So things don't bother me. I knew that I had to leave my cousin's house because things had become difficult there. And I was going to go and ask my friend who lives near Colchester if I could come and stay with her for a couple of weeks. So I was walking back from the job and I was walking back to my cousin's, and I was going to go and say to him, look, I can't stay here anymore. I need to find another way. And I stopped in the street and started laughing my head off at just the situation that I was in. Because, you know, what I have learned is that it doesn't matter how bad things get, it'll be all right. It's going to be okay. And it always is, because things always work themselves out. If you've got food and you can go and, we're lucky. We live in a society where if there's something wrong, you can go and get help. A lot of societies don't have those luxuries. So we're really lucky in that sense. And I know that. In the back of my head, I know that. Yeah, I can't stay in negative situations. I would be on the street rather than stay in a negative situation, because I will do anything to stay sober. Anything. I will go through anyone or anything in order to stay sober. That's my priority, because if I'm not sober, I'm a dead man, and that's it. Bottom line. Well, homelessness is not just about people who are homeless. It's not just about people who are on the streets. Homelessness is it affects lots of people who you would never know are homeless. If you read the book, you will find a few stories in there about such people. There are lots of people who sleep on their friends' couches. There are lots of people who actually sleep in cars and still go to work. This is becoming more and more visible. We're seeing working people who are homeless. I read a story just last week about a woman who was homeless, who was using food banks, who was using soup kitchens, who was working full time, and who was sleeping in a phone box in London. And this is very common. So homelessness is not just about the archetypal vagrant on the streets. It's much bigger than that. And I think we often, with most things, we have very exact ideas about things and make assumptions about things. All of us do. We need to think about this differently, because until we can actually get our heads around what homelessness means and the myriad of people, types of people that homelessness can affect, we're never going to solve these problems. I went to stay with my friend near Colchester, and while I was there, I was figuring out what I was going to do next, and I done Google searches, and I found the homeless organisation, Emmaus, and it was in Colchester, and that wasn't far from where my friend lived. So I rang them up and told them I was coming down to see them. So I went down there. It was the beginning of February in 2016, and they said, yeah, come on. Yeah. The difference between Emmaus and hostels and a lot of other homelessness organisations is the work ethic. It's very important. You have to be able and willing to work 40 hours a week in social enterprise to be part of the organisation. And that is major. It's a major thing, because it often stops people from allowing their heads to take over. It stops boredom, and addiction, part of the problem with addiction is exactly that, is boredom, and people don't know what to do with themselves. So if people are occupied, it makes things much, much easier, and that's what Emmaus does. It gives people a purpose. It gives people their purpose back, if you like, in some cases. And, you know, it really is an amazing organisation. There are 29 communities altogether on this island. It started in like 1991. There's one in Glasgow, one in South Wales, and the others are all in England. And there are new communities starting up all the time. Emmaus is a rebuilding community. When you look at the history, the recent history over the last few decades in this country, you can see how community is gradually breaking down as the population rises and as the social fabric of the country changes. You're seeing community break down. Emmaus is rebuilding that. These communities are giving something back, and in many cases, as with this community in Cambridge, the communities become hubs of the wider community. This community is very well supported by people in the local area, and a lot of the other communities are as well, and that's the beauty of the organisation, and it really can't be understated, you know. This is the future. This is how we solve the social problems that we have. This organisation, there should be one of these communities in every town. The book's called No Homeless Problem and Other Poems. It's basically compiled from stories. So there's 71 poems, and they're compiled from the stories of 44 individuals. I basically came up with the idea myself. I wanted to give something back. I'm an alcoholic, and one of the things that I learned is that in order to stay sober, I need to give something back. I always need to be given something back. So I always look for ways to do that. And this organisation was helping me immensely. And I felt that I needed to do something, that I needed to give something back. So I went to 6 communities apart from this one, so 7 communities altogether. I went to Hull, Lambeth, Gloucester, Bristol, Mossley, which is near Manchester, and Norfolk and Waveney, which is not far from Norwich. And I basically spoke to people in the Emmaus communities, those that wanted to speak to me about it. And I used their stories and turned their stories into poems, which I then put into the book. There was a major there was a very set structure to how I wrote the book, and what I wanted to achieve. And the reason why I did it the way I did it was because homelessness is not just about the individual. The problem with an issue like homelessness, and often with addiction and mental and emotional problems as well, is as a society, we judge people based often on behaviour and individual merits and what's going on in an immediate sense, but we don't think about how these things are, where these things are coming from, and how people end up the way they end up. We don't think about that. We just think about the immediate, and we judge people on an immediate basis. So I did this because I wanted to, in effect, be the voice. So although there's another person behind the poem that I have written, I'm the one who's saying it, and that removes the individuality. That it's not about them anymore, and it's not about me. It's about us. It's about all of us. And this is something that we need to learn, because society has become very, very individualistic lately. And individualism, while it's fine, too much of it can be very harmful, because we stop seeing. It's the forest for trees syndrome. You can't see the forest because you're looking at the trees. We need to get back and realize that when certain issues are affecting hundreds of thousands of people, then it's not about individuals anymore, is it? The majority of people in society are not thinking about society. They're not worried about society. The majority of people don't care. And I mean working people and supposedly decent people, people who call themselves decent. People go home in the evenings from work and they don't do anything. They play games, they watch TV, they socialise with their friends, they keep to themselves. That doesn't work. If you're part of society, you need to work for society. You need to do something within your community. You need to help out. We're not doing that. That's what's wrong. That's where the community breaks down, because people are not taking part. People are not getting involved. And that's what's wrong with society. We need to volunteer our services. We need to work. We need to do something for our community instead of being so selfish. And that's the selfishness. It comes from individualism. This is basic stuff. It's very, very clear. But the majority of people don't even know. I mean, people don't even know what sociology is. They're not interested in these subjects. We need to study. We need to think about humanity. We need to think about what we're doing. We're seeing change recently. We've seen something happen with plastic. A watershed has been reached. A major watershed has been reached with plastic. For decades, people didn't care about it. They weren't interested. And recently this has changed. And there's more social awareness. That needs to increase. We need to change the education system so children are taught about themselves. They're taught about emotions. They're taught about mental and emotional conditions. They're taught about social illnesses, which nobody ever talks about and people don't even think exist. And addiction and all of these issues. The reason why all of the problems and anger and addiction and mental and emotional problems within society exist is because there's something wrong. We need to solve that. But you can't solve it solely by focusing on the messed up adults. Somebody needs to make sure all the children are raised properly. Because if they're not raised properly, you end up with messed up adults. That's it. That's where the change needs to occur. Fish and chips. I was tired, I was hungry, I was freezing. I was waiting for enough people to put enough into my plastic cup so I could buy fish and chips. 4 lads walked past me, dressed in material privilege, drunkenly happy. One of them was going to put money into my cup when his friend said, "Don't give them money, they'll just drink it." The lad hesitated and he looked at me. "Will you drink it?" he asked. "I don't drink," I told him. "I just want fish and chips."